From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Thanks for listening. Today, K-State's Alison Crane will discuss co-species or multi-species pasture grazing. She's been working with cattle producers on grazing systems that incorporate sheep and goats, either with the cattle or in direct rotation with cattle grazing. And she'll talk about why this idea is gaining interest. Also, from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen will review some of the lead developments in agricultural law and taxation in 2020 that didn't quite make his annual top 10 list, but that he says were nonetheless significant for agricultural interests. And awaiting with another Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven further ahead on this Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Good to have you aboard for this Agriculture Today. During our first segment, we're going to pick up on a topic that's making the rounds here in Kansas, and it's something that our guest has been visiting with livestock producers about with more frequency of late: co-species grazing of forage resources. Alison Crane is with us. Alison is the sheep and goat specialist with K-State Research and Extension and has received a swarm of questions about this particular approach to grazing management, Alison. And what's the interest here? Why do you think this has really gained some traction?
Well, in the past couple of years, we've had a lot of forage availability, and I think almost a surplus in some of those years of forages, along with also in some of those years a depression in cattle prices, but an increase in sheep and goat prices. And also sheep and goats are increasing in the state, statewide numbers, with all those things kind of culminating all at once. I think that we are seeing that increased interest in how do we utilize all of these species at the same time. People are looking to diversify. That's my outlook anyway.
So when we talk about co-grazing, to lend definition here, two or more species on the same acreage at the same time, right?
Yes. So there's a couple of different ways to talk about it. I always break it into two main categories of controlled versus continuous grazing. So continuous grazing is what conventionally we think about in most places in the U.S., having one species of livestock, usually in a few large traps or paddocks, pastures, however you want to call them. So then you're not really rotating those species through those at all, or maybe just a couple in a year. But there's no pressure on the forages that are available, whether that's improved forages or native. But then within controlled grazing, there's many facets of controlled grazing. There's strip grazing, rotational grazing, and then we have co-species and multi-species. So co-species is two species of livestock, whether that's cattle, horses, goats, sheep. And so within the co-species and multi-species grazing, some people are grazing the multiple species at the same time in those different traps, or a lot of times, because there is still that connotation of you don't want to see the sheep or the goats in the same pasture as the cows, especially if people are worried about parasites, because that's a common, I like to call it a myth. Some people might not like that wording, but a common myth that the sheep or the goats are going to contaminate the cattle with parasites. And some people, it's just a visual, eyesore. And so then we'll graze typically the cattle first through a pasture and then sheep and goats in behind. So I still call those co-species or multi-species grazing, but we're just doing it rotationally.
Well, then, what are some of the most prominent principles to think about here in conducting a co- or multi-species grazing program? The first thing that comes to mind intuitively is, what can that grazing resource support?
Yeah, so of course that's dependent on where you're at, whether that's in the state of Kansas. Of course, we have huge variations within the state of Kansas. I mean, you go to northeast Kansas, some people say that their stocking rates of sheep are 8-to-1, so 8 sheep to 1 cow-calf pair, which is very high. But in a good moisture, good forage year, I've seen some of those very people that are saying 8-to-1 grazing rates, and it's sometimes you look out on their pastures and you think they could maybe stand a couple more sheep out there. So, and it all depends on what's available. And so that's when we get into kind of grazing behavior as well of the different species. And so I always say know what your stocking rates for cattle are, because usually when we're talking about co-grazing, it's people trying to add another species on top of cattle. So if you know what your cattle stocking rates are, typically the rule of thumb is 5-to-1 for sheep. So 5 sheep to every 1 cow, or 6 goats to every 1 cow. And that's a really good starting place. And if you're in a good moisture year. Now, if you're in a more of a drought type year, you might want to reduce that a little bit. Or if you're very uncomfortable, have never done anything like this before, I always say start on the low end. Then you can work your way up. But the last thing you want is to run into a wreck where you don't have enough forage available for the animals. But really, past that, it really depends on what forage you have available. So when we talk about native pasture, the more diverse those pastures are, the better utilization you're going to have, because the grazing behavior of the animals. So cattle are the most specific or the most picky, at least out of cattle, sheep, and goats, So that's why we encourage people to graze cattle first. So they can go in, get the grasses that they desire, and then you can rotate them into the next trap. And this is where we want to split up those big traps. I know some people, if you're grazing very large traps, we're talking sections, half sections, some people split them down into 80-acre sections and then graze through those. And that's if you have, some large groups of cattle, large groups of sheep. If you're grazing smaller numbers than that, I say break them down even further into smaller acre paddocks, and then you're going to rotate more and more through those. And with that, you just get more targeted grazing. And the more targeted you can be, the better results you're going to see. Because then when you rotate those sheep or those goats behind the cattle, they're going to be even more specific on what they're targeting, and they're going to be forced. And that's really the whole purpose of what we're doing. People always want to think that we're managing cattle or managing sheep or managing goats, but you're really managing the grassland, especially in the native type grasses. The biggest learning curve is learning how to read the forages. Mm-hmm. And the great rule of thumb is don't graze below 4 inches of height. And there's some forages, depending on what you have available on your pastures, that are even higher than that, about 5 to 6 inches of height. You don't want to graze below that. The number one reason why is parasites. So the larvae of the parasites have to get above that 4-inch mark to be ingested most of the time and to reach maturation. And so if you are grazing below that, the sheep or the goat is going to ingest those, more likely to ingest those. But they really have a hard time, the larvae, getting above that mark. The second reason for the 4 to 6 inches is the leaflets. So plants, to go into production, have to have leaves to undergo photosynthesis. You have to leave leaves. And if you don't, that plant's going to go dormant or not regrow. And then that's why we see overgrazing and patches of dirt. And then you get erosion, and then you're going down a very dark path for that grassland.
Where it's hard to recover over several years' time.
Yes, very hard to recover. I mean, some of the western grasslands, it takes them 30, 40 years to overcome some of that overgrazing. We definitely don't want to go down that path, especially in our native grasslands. So I always tell people, if you're new to it, walk your pastures. And that's the great thing about rotational grazing is if you're rotating pastures every 2 to 3 days, you're going to learn so much more about the grasses and what works and what doesn't. And everything is so particular to each operation, too.
Have to ask you, though, about the bottom line. Yeah. The economic side of it, the opportunity for profitability from these systems. What do we know?
Yeah, so when I've done these talks this past year, I incorporated, probably a lot of people know of Shane Tiffany Cattle Company, because he's one of the biggest cattle producers in the state that has implemented this co-grazing sheep into his cattle system, and has had a lot of success in that system. And so he's done the quick math of, is this profitable in the grand scheme of things or not? And what he has shown and what he has said himself is that it is. And so I wrote down a few quick numbers. I'm not going to do a whole lot of math here, but if you look at our stocking rates for sheep, for example, it's 5-to-1. So if you just say a ewe on average is about $200 a head, on the same acreage as a cow, $1,000 cow, we're just doing round numbers here, you can have 5 ewes that are going to be the same worth as that $1,000 cow. Okay, that $1,000 cow probably is only going to produce 1 calf a year. Then we talk about our ewe and what she's going to produce. The average rate for those ewes is about 1.7 lambs per ewe. Each ewe is raising, and this is just one lambing, $180. You have 5 ewes on that acreage that one cow is going to be on.
Reaching equilibrium here.
Yes, all of a sudden we become, that $200 ewe has almost paid for herself in one lambing. Most cows, it takes them a couple of years to pay for themselves. So diversifying your operation can also be a really safe thing on the profitability side of things. And not to mention, you're increasing your plant diversity in these native grazing situations. You can increase your gain per acre and average daily gain of all the animals present. In the big scheme of things, it's a pretty profitable situation and a great way to diversify your operation.
Requires intensive management, but the compatibility is there, and because you have been talking this up with producers, you avail yourself to anybody else out there who might be intrigued by the idea of co-species grazing.
Definitely, yeah.
So contact Alison here at Kansas State University. Very easy to find in the Animal Sciences and Industry Department directory online. Thanks for going over this with us, Alison.
Thanks for having me.
Again, she's been talking up co- or multiple species grazing of livestock, as Alison Crane, sheep and goat specialist, K-State Research and Extension. We'll be back in a moment. This is Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today is back now. And once again with us from the Washburn University School of Law, a professor of agricultural law and taxation there, Roger McEowen. He's with us every other Wednesday, as you know. This time, we're going to, as we are wont to do at this point, reflect on the agricultural law and tax developments in this past year, 2020. Roger routinely puts together a list of those lead developments that happen in any given year. Actually, you have 2 lists, one of which we'll cover today, Roger, the top 10 developments, and then those that didn't quite make the cut, important developments nonetheless that occurred in 2020. That's what we'll tackle today. And so we'll trip right through these, but before we do, basically, how do you go about this process of identifying what's been the most important of the last year?
Well, Eric, what I do, as many know, and I'm sure you know, every day I look at the cases, I look at the rulings that impact agriculture, not only Kansas, Midwest, Plain States, but nationwide. And I do that, and I catalog those on my website. And when we come down near the end of the year, I go back and shuffle through those hundreds of annotations that I have summarized and what's happened during the year and kind of break it down and create a big list and then sort through them and break it out into what I've deemed to be the most relevant developments in ag law and ag tax of the past year as it impacts the entire ag sector. And often that means we're going to be looking at a federal case or something the IRS did, something that has nationwide impact on farming and ranching and on the sector as a whole. And then There are some that are pretty big, pretty important, but just not quite big enough from a nationwide standpoint to make the top 10. And that's what we're going to cover today. These are big ones. These are important, but not quite as important as the top 10.
Well, then we'll briefly summarize each of these. And the first we'll tackle today, this was a look at whether tax that is withheld in the routine procedures has to be refunded in effect in a bankruptcy situation.
Right, Eric. This one is specific to Chapter 12 bankruptcy, and what we can do in a Chapter 12, which is specific for farmers, is that we can deprioritize taxes. That means that the IRS, state claims, local claims, they no longer have priority in the bankruptcy estate. They can be moved to the back of the line and paid on the same level as a general unsecured creditor once the farmer receives a discharge. The question that came up in 2020 was whether that rule also applies to previously withheld taxes. Say you have a spouse that has an off-farm job and they're having taxes withheld from the paycheck. Well, when you file bankruptcy, Chapter 12, can you claw those previously paid withheld taxes back into the bankruptcy estate and deprioritize them? The answer is, by the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, no. There has to be an outstanding claim at the time the bankruptcy petition is filed. Those taxes were already paid. There's no longer a claim with respect to those.
The next one on your list here is also related to bankruptcy. This is something we brought up not too long ago in our conversation here, the preferential payment rule, and tied into the bankruptcy situation of a major dairy processor.
That's right. This is the Dean Foods bankruptcy, and this came up in late 2020, just before Thanksgiving. Some dairy farmers that had sold milk to Dean Foods shortly before they filed bankruptcy, Dean Foods filed bankruptcy, received demand letters from the law firm representing the bankruptcy trustee telling the farmers that they needed to pay those proceeds back to the bankruptcy estate, needed to refund that money that they were paid. For some dairy farmers, that was several thousands of dollars worth of milk proceeds. And that startled a lot of farmers. The answer to that is Dean Foods can do that. There's a 90-day window known as the preferential payment period, where if you were paid within that 90 days of Dean Foods filing bankruptcy, they can claw those proceeds back. However, I think the vast majority, if not just about all, of those dairy farmers receiving those demand letters can use an exclusionary rule known as their ordinary business rule. So if they did business with Dean Foods in the ordinary course of their business, they do not have to pay those funds back. They are not subject to the preferential payment rule.
Another case that happened this past year, this was a hog nuisance suit and a court ruling. You talked about this at length when we previously brought it up, and you might remind us of the details.
This was a federal trial court down in North Carolina that coordinated 26 related cases against similar hog production operations brought by about 500 plaintiffs in a master case docket, and that went to trial back in 2017. What happened in 2020 was that the United States Circuit Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit upheld the trial court's determination awarding $750,000 in compensatory damages to these neighbors that were affected by this, the nuisance issues and the odors and the manure issues associated with these large-scale confinement hog operations. Very, very big award, one of the biggest we've ever seen on the ag nuisance side of things. And this, I think the impact of this is that a number of states have already and will be amending their state laws to try to more closely align themselves with giving more protection to these types of livestock facilities from nuisance-type lawsuits. And I think that's likely what we're going to see arise out of this.
So it may well be a tone setter on that major issue. There was a case that was ruled upon as well in 2020, and recalling here, it was an individual who lost their right to bear firearms because of a felony conviction. Tell us what this was about and why it's of significance here.
Well, this was an individual that did plead guilty back in 2011 to willfully making a materially false statement on her federal income tax return. Well, that, because it is a felony to do that, willfully make a materially false statement on a federal tax return, because it is a felony, then the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit says she loses her Second Amendment rights for the rest of her life. And that's really the kicker in this one. This was a first offense. She had never had another situation where she had filed a false tax return, and the Third Circuit really lowered the boom on her in the way they construed the law on that. I think this one is ripe to be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. I think the U.S. Supreme Court will likely hear this case and will probably reverse it. There are a couple of justices that have disagreed with what the Third Circuit has done in previous opinions before they were on the Supreme Court. So I think this is one that's important to agriculture because Second Amendment rights are very, very important for us in the ag sector, and the loss of those rights needs to come with some pretty strict scrutiny. And I think that we'll see this one pop up on the U.S. Supreme Court's radar in 2021.
Next, then, to mention here, there have been, in recent times, certain governmental cash grants to support renewable energy development, and there was a series of happenings in 2020 regarding that.
Right, Eric. What happened was back in 2009, as a result of the so-called stimulus bill back in 2009, there was a provision in there called the Section 1603 grants. These are grants in lieu of tax credits. And what has happened is it's created an industry where some companies that are trying to use these grants create sub-entities and structure transactions so that they can maximize, and some would say illegally, obtain a level of grants that they're not entitled to. And there's been a lot of litigation on this. The IRS looks at these very, very closely, and the government won a very significant case in 2020 and significantly reduced the amount of grant that a business, an energy company, was actually entitled to. So I think the case is significant because it could impact the computation of the tax credits for future projects. And I think that's, we in agriculture, we have these wind farms, we have solar farms. These are the types of entities that I'm talking about here that can claim these grants. The point here is IRS looks at this very closely, and they won a big case on it in 2020.
Also in the tax arena, there were adjustments this past year in income tax regulations affecting trusts. You might summarize.
That's right. When we go back and we look at the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was signed into law in late 2017 that took effect in 2018, the result of that is far fewer individuals will itemize deductions these days because of the change in the law. We've removed a lot of the itemized deductions that people can claim and doubled the standard deduction. So it just makes sense for a lot of people to no longer try to itemize. Well, the questions we had was, how does that impact the removal of itemized deductions? How does that impact deductions that can be claimed by a trust? Well, the IRS gave us some very favorable, in my view, final regulations in 2020 that said those changes on the individual side don't really impact the income tax treatment of how we handle trusts. And this is a big issue for agriculture because there's a lot of farmland, there's a lot of agricultural property that's held in trust from an estate planning as well as a business planning purpose. The good news is we can still claim a lot of those deductions that we'd feared might be lost because of the change that started in 2018. The answer is we can still get those deductions at the trust level.
Well, we're about two-thirds of the way through, Roger, this rundown on the almost top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments of 2020. We do want to finish it out, and we'll do so after this break. Once again with us, Roger McEowen of the Washburn University School of Law. We'll be back with Roger shortly here on the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
This is Agriculture Today from Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson back with you. And as we conclude our visit with Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. We're in the midst of covering Roger's almost top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments of 2020. And what we'll take up next, Roger, is in fact a Kansas-based case on an issue very much on the radar of producers here. Misrepresentation, if you will, of livestock facilities and how they operate was deemed protected speech.
Well, these laws are in a number of states. In fact, Kansas had the very first state law dealing with this, and they're known euphemistically as ag-gag laws. I don't like that, but that's what people know them as. Basically, it's a legislative reaction to people trying to gain access to confinement animal livestock facilities by false pretenses with the intent to do harm to those facilities. And so Kansas enacted a statute in 1990 and said you can't do that. You can't lie materially to get access to a facility, to then record things inside and tape things and do all those types of activities. Well, those laws have been challenged across the country in some of these states as unconstitutional. Largely, they have been deemed to be unconstitutional. Same thing happened in 2020 in Kansas. The Kansas law was deemed to be unconstitutional, and then in the summer of 2020, the federal court here in Kansas entered an injunction against enforcement of that law. So we'll see what the legislature's response is going to be in 2021. But that's been a big issue across the country. Kansas having the very first statute, it's now been deemed to be unconstitutional.
It definitely is a hot-button topic in agricultural circles. And right-to-farm laws were looked at again in the courts in 2020. And anything new developing here, Roger?
Well, there's always a number of right-to-farm cases. The one in North Carolina I talked about earlier did involve the North Carolina right-to-farm statute, but a real big one out of Indiana in 2020 that the U.S. Supreme Court declined to review late in the year involved two aspects of the same family. You had a senior member of the family that had retired, stayed on the farm, lived in the home that he was born in about 80 years ago, and then you had another branch of the family that continued the operation. They lived on another part of the farm in a home they built about 50 years ago. And then the younger generation converted the row crop operation to a large-scale hog confinement operation, 8,000 hogs in a confinement building. And that created the odor issues, the manure issues. And so now you've got the older generation of the family suing the younger generation. And the courts in Indiana said, well, agriculture is agriculture. There was a change in the operation, but it's still agriculture, so the right to farm law covers that. And that was upheld on appeal, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear that case. And so we don't ever get to the taking issue, the constitutional taking issue in this. That's a big case. And again, some other states, as I mentioned with respect to the North Carolina case, some other states concerning this one are looking at the Indiana statute perhaps as a model to mirror their state laws after as they decide whether to amend them or not.
Well, one of the more unconventional rulings that took place this past year, and we discussed it as well during the calendar year 2020, whether or not dinosaur fossils fall under mineral rights stipulations.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and of course in Kansas and other states that have oil and gas production, we have the potential for different owners of the surface estate and the subsurface estate. Who owns the surface? Who owns the minerals? Well, what happened in the Montana situation a few years ago was that there were very, very valuable dinosaur fossils, intact Tyrannosaurus rex and the like that were found on a ranch in central Montana worth multi-millions of dollars. And there had been a severance when the current ranch owners bought the ranch. The seller had severed the minerals to an extent from the surface estate. So the owners, the new owners who owned the surface, owned part of the minerals, as well as there was a reserved right in the minerals by the prior owners. Well, once the dinosaur fossils were discovered, the mineral owners, the prior owners of the surface who still owned the minerals, surfaced and they said, look, we're entitled to some of the proceeds of those sales. And the court ultimately said, no, you're not. Fossils are not included in the definition of minerals. They are not mined like a natural resource is mined. They are dug from the surface. They are uncovered that way. They are not mined. They are not minerals. And so dinosaur fossils belong to the surface owner.
So if you stumble upon a relic of that sort on your land, duly noted there. And the last thing we'll talk about today And it does relate to the coronavirus situation in large part and the interferences in normal course of activity. This has to do with contractual obligations. And when something like the coronavirus checks in, how much must parties adhere to those contract requirements?
That's right. We saw, not only in Kansas, but in many other states, we had executive orders by state governors as a result of the anticipated impact of the virus that shut down a lot of economic activity. Well, if you're a farmer and you have a contract and now your supply chain is disrupted, what recourse do you have when you can't sell corn to an ethanol plant? Or you can't sell your hogs because the processing plant is shut down, or you can't sell your milk because the milk buyer backs out of a milk contract because the milk market has disintegrated. So that brought back a legal concept that we really hadn't paid attention to for many, many years, known as force majeure. And if you've got that type of clause language in your contract, it may give you certain rights in the event that performance now becomes impossible. And that's what those contract clauses are designed to deal with. And so they're not uncommon in contracts. And basically, it's how are we going to allocate the risk? And in essence, how are we going to free ourselves from liability or obligation when there's an extraordinary event or circumstance that's beyond our control that prevents at least one of the parties from fulfilling their contract obligations. So very important clause. That came back in 2020 as a result of the virus.
Well, that is your almost top 10, and noting the significance of these developments, that ought to give folks a notion of just how impactful the top 10 will be when we cover those 2 weeks from now, Roger. Appreciate you going over all of this with us, and we'll welcome you back to take on that list next time. Many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric.
Roger McEowen with us. Roger is a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. And again, he covers all of this information on his website, washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. Take a look. This is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
When young, we need a big world. But when we're getting older, the world is getting smaller.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
I'm dreaming, just dreaming of the beginning of the new year. I hope it will be a good year. Surely it will be better than 2020. A week ago, I watched a nature program on TV about the interaction between buffalo and wolves in the wild. It was filmed in a large park in northern Canada. The film played through the 4 seasons. It showed the year of wolves and the buffalo with pups and calves. The herd was a very small herd. The scenery was expansive. Great country. North America is a big continent, and the USA is a big country in a small world. When young, we need a big world, but when we're getting older, the world is getting smaller. We don't travel as far anymore, if we travel at all. Our needs, as we get older, are getting smaller also. Or are they? As I was dreaming, I wondered about that. Of course, aging starts to put limits on us. But can our surroundings not stimulate us and lift us out of possible lethargy? To start off, I must say that I'm no expert on aging. But in my work, I have visited enough retirement homes to get a feeling of what I think is refreshing and uplifting. I'm convinced that even with the best care, older people need more. They need a safe environment, but there needs to be the stimuli. We know we have extensive forests. But if you're in a forest, you will only see so many trees as your vision can hold standing among the tree trunks. And that's not that many. I have visited the forests on the West Coast and in Germany. I enjoyed it. They were beautiful, but they are over there. On the farm, I have a few cedar groupings of only cedars, and when I walk among them, I can pretend or dream I'm in a large forest. At least, it does take my mind back to the other places I once visited and walked. But being where I am gives me a strong sense of place, and that is what I think is very important. To stimulate the memory, it does not have to be a large area. I even have it here on the hill, where a small cluster of cedar stands, and I look at or walk under. With snow and ice, the branches are covered. Standing close together, the trees show their trunks, which is part of their beauty. A single cedar standing in the field tends to grow wide, holding on to its lower branches. Sometimes a low, sweeping branch will lay on the ground, and I've seen where they will root to become an independent shrub or tree crowding the parent plant. Once rooted, one could cut it off and dig it up and plant it somewhere else. Just a thought. But it is walking between the clear trunks I like. Where groups of cedars or evergreens make a statement, so does a singular oak in a meadow. Cattle may gather under it on a hot day. Maybe they should be grazing, but if such a tree is available, they tend to seek the comfort. The interesting thing is a singular tree like that is a world in itself with all the activity which goes on among its branches. There will be many insects, the good and the bad. There will be songbirds looking for the insects. In the top, a hawk might perch and look for a mouse or mole. The deciduous tree will celebrate the 4 seasons with snow and ice. The tree will be different. Thinking of retirement homes, the dream provides each room a comfortable balcony with shade where shade is needed. The ground floor will have shaded patios to sit outside on a good summer day. All the overhangs should be wide enough that one could sit outside and stay outside when a summer shower occurs. To smell the rain is a gift. You don't have to go anywhere and take a deep breath. If it is a spring rain or summer shower, it will be great. Afterwards, you hear the bird songs. That is, if the garden has been designed for songbirds to enjoy. It can all be done and does not have to cost a fortune, but it must be designed well. When older people have moved, they may lose their sense of place, the place they belong to, where they worked and lived. They need their sense of place, and that is not only their room or apartment. The outside and grounds are part of it. At least, it would be for me, as long as I could move. The garden should be bold and simple, yet diverse and interesting, with clear paths and plenty of benches, placed very carefully so that people who want to or need to can sit and have some privacy. And at the same time, let there be gathering places. Just imagine what a safe fire pit could mean for old folks. They would remember long ago camping trips with family and kids. My dream is not to take memories away from older people. Contrary, keep making them. As I think of retirement homes I visited, they all seem to have been dark. Maybe there's a reason for that. But I would want to see a huge atrium where sunlight enters and plants grow to add greenery and filter the air. Oh, I can dream on.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. So goes today's edition. Remember, we archive each day's program at agtoday.net for listening anytime you choose. Also, the details on subscribing to our podcast download service are right there as well. Check it out, agtoday.net. We'll be right back here this same time tomorrow, and hope you will be likewise. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today, over this, the K-State Radio Network.